I'm honored and delighted to address this esteemed assembly, and thank you for the invitation to present my work. Let me start with a personal story. It's about a friend with whom I grew up. We grew up in a very small village. She lived on the top of the hill with her very well-to-do parents. They were Sabres. And for me, as a child of Holocaust survivors, new refugees, it was obviously something to look up at. This was truly a Mayflower family in all senses. And as she grew up, she did very, very well for herself. She has a terrific career, a very loving family. But when she turned 40, just about, she decided to go into psychotherapy. And during psychotherapy, or shortly thereafter, she started having all kind of very strange flashbacks. Most of them had sexual context. And in the course of therapy, she came to the conclusion, but they were very fragmented. It was some sensations. She didn't have any vivid memories of what was happening or what had happened. But she came to the conclusion, with the help of her therapist, that she had been a victim of incest, that she has been sexually molested by her father. At that point in therapy, both the therapist and my friend decided to confront the father, and they've asked him to come to one of the therapeutic sessions. The father totally denied it. He was very, very upset. And he said to her, "My dear, you're a very troubled young lady, and I'm willing to pay for therapy and help you in whichever way I can. But clearly none of that has ever happened. It's all a fragment of your imagination." Let me just see if I got the, yeah, okay. No. They've changed the computer, so it will take me a minute. But what I will, אני רוצה לעבור כאן? Okay, okay. So sorry. כאן, ככה? Okay. So my friend's story actually illuminates some of the controversies that are related to traumatic memory. And on some of them, I'll try to cast some light. These controversies relate to the pertinent questions as follow. Is memory of traumatic events different than traumatic or more mundane non-traumatic events? Can traumatic events be indeed forgotten? Can they be repressed? Can repressed memories surface even decades after the event? Do people remember, or was her father right? And do people remember traumatic events that never happened? Traumatic events are extreme stressful experiences that entail threat to life. And they clearly shatter many of our widely held assumptions about safety, and they give rise to overwhelming feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. Obviously, when we confront a traumatic event, we confront our own death. And usually we try to deny the possibility of our imminent death. But traumatic events don't let us do it. So we are kind of flooded with annihilation anxiety. In most cases, the majority of cases, people are able to overcome those anxieties. But in some cases, up to 20% in some events, it culminates in debilitating psychopathology in the form of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. But since we're encountering such overwhelming and distressing traumas, it calls for drastic coping mechanisms. And I will dwell briefly on two of them. One of them is dissociation, and the other is repression. Since we cannot possibly escape the tsunami, the war captivity, what we can do is psychologically detach ourselves somehow from the inescapable reality. So these drastic coping measures that help us deal with the noxious stimuli often result in unprocessed and fragmented coding of information. That is, we don't quite have we don't quite grasp the totality of the situation and particularly the details that it entails. Dissociation. All of you, maybe some of you are not familiar with the term, but you all dissociate. Maybe if the lecture gets to be a little boring, you kind of start daydreaming. You drive your car and all of a sudden you say, well, part of the road I don't quite recall. But this is a natural mechanism that we all employ all the time. But it's a rather complex mental process, and it entails changes in consciousness which describe the normally connected functioning of identity, memory, thoughts, feeling, and experiences. And in a sense, it disrupts the normal integration of those experiences into consciousness. For instance, and particularly during peri-traumatic situation, that is, once the trauma is being unfolded, we experience and we see across numerous types of traumatic events a host of dissociative responses. For instance, a very dramatic one that is often told by rape victims. I was lying there and he was on top of me, but at the same time I could see myself as if I was an angel looking at the situation from the outside. Or a soldier that I've interviewed once told me that he went through the entire Yom Kippur War, which was, during very brutal battles, but he didn't feel any sense of danger. The reason was that he was an avid photographer, and he felt as if he had this imaginary camera, and he was looking at the war through those lenses of the camera. So dissociations can often be quite functional during the peri-traumatic period. And they're actually raised automatically during that time. But oftentimes they linger on, and they outlast the peri-traumatic period and actually become part and parcel of one's character or one's personality. And it is reflected in detachment, in psychic numbing, and in rare cases in some amnesia. Dissociation is frequently observed, as I said, across numerous or wide range of traumatic events. And despite the differences in age and experience and whatnot, we see it quite often in childhood sexual abuse, in soldiers on the battlefield, and in other cases. And you can see some of the figures with regard to how frequent dissociation is actually being used. Repression is the second coping mechanism or defense mechanism, pretty much as depicted by the horrific picture at the bottom of the slide. This is a defensive, automatic, unconscious process by which distressing thoughts, memories, or impulses are excluded from consciousness. And clinical studies and observations have consistently documented that the earlier in life, the more violent and the more repetitive the trauma is, the more likely its results in repressive memories. But at the same time, I've also seen repression quite often during the 35 years that I've been following prisoners of war and traumatized veterans from numerous Israeli wars. As I said, most individuals are able to withstand and sustain the heat of battle or the heat of trauma without succumbing to stress. Nonetheless, a small but yet considerable proportion of people continue to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a highly debilitating and very distressing anxiety disorder. In a nutshell, the individual who now no longer is exposed to the trauma continues to feel and behave as if he or she is still experiencing the traumatic event. And the symptom clusters consist of re-experiencing flashbacks. You can sit in this in a comfortable chair in Jerusalem, listening to a talk, being in a quite safe environment, and all of a sudden, the traumatized soldiers continues to hear the screams of his comrades in arms. He senses the heat. He can even smell the blood or the gunpowder. Toward those traumatizing and quite daunting symptoms, the human psychic uses all kind of mechanism One of them is avoidance and numbing, that is trying to kind of anesthetize the hurting part. And obviously there are all kind of alteration in moods and hyperarousal to keep us alert. But as I said, PTSD is seen as an anxiety disorder. This is how it's classified in DSM. But in fact, it could very well be presented or seen or explained as a disorder of memory as well. Because PTSD hallmark symptom is involuntary and persistent and unwanted recollection of the traumatic events. So there is this difficulty to forget, and at the same time, there is also the difficulty to remember. Because in some cases, I don't know how many of you saw the Israeli movie Betzilo Shel Helem Krav, but it depicts two individuals. One cannot remember, the other cannot forget. Unfortunately, in reality, traumatized individuals experience at the same time those conflicting experiences. So what about PTSD and memory? Patients with PTSD often experience severe and debilitating memory problems. Multiple studies across a wide range of traumatic events show impairment in declarative memory, that is the ability to remember and reproduce material that is associated with the trauma. In rare cases, such as World War I, there have been numerous cases of amnesia. We have seen only partial amnesia in recent Israeli wars since Yom Kippur. At the same time, however, the flashbacks and nightmares continue to daunt the individual. We were told already that memory is not fixed, and here I'm using Elizabeth Loftus. Those of you who, the psychologist among you, might know her name. She's famous, infamous, depending on your point of view. But I'm using her, let me quote her. She says, with regard to the nature of memory, people believe that memory is like a tape recorder, that we can simply retrieve what we store. In fact, it's more like Wikipedia, as you and others can change it. And it seems that our memories, as we already heard, are not perfect, and over time they fade, distorted, and as Loftus and others have claimed, can also be fabricated. Rabin assassination was mentioned a couple of times. Where were you when Rabin was assassinated? What do you remember of the event? The same question could be asked about other very well-known experiences such as 9/11. And the memories associated with those conspicuous events is known as flashbulb memories, and they're believed to be detailed, vivid, and accurate. However, large longitudinal studies in the wake of 9/11 found that there is dramatic inconsistencies in the recollection of 9/11, including simple questions: where were you, what did you do, and that sort of thing. And those inconsistencies are actually projecting current feelings. So traumatic memory can impair the encoding as the attention is narrowed, as we've seen with the processes of dissociation. And many of the traumatic experiences are imprinted as sensations and feelings and not necessarily transcribed into clear narratives, which makes them quite difficult, and therefore, like in the case of my friend, people find it very difficult to believe to believe that these events have actually happened. Also, traumatic memory and trauma in general entails repetition compulsion. We keep having, if I'm traumatized, I keep having every night the same dream, or almost every night the same dream, but it changes in the process. And research suggests that reactivation of fear-laden memories are vulnerable to distortion as they undergo reconsolidation during each retrieval. So each time we have those experiences, it kind of changes, in a sense, some of the memories. So the question then becomes, can memories be fabricated? Can they be transplanted, as my girlfriend's father claimed? There have been a series of experimental, psychologists love to do, experimental psychologists, that is, love to run some sort of all kind of experiments. I won't go into great detail. This is one of the most famous ones, where people were told that they were actually lost in the mall when they were young, an event that did not really happen in reality. And later on, when they were confronted and told that they have been manipulated, 20% of those who were told that they were manipulated did not accept the memory as false. And in fact, across a host, I mean, those of you who are interested, there are dozens of studies like that showing how memory can be fabricated or transplanted. One of the studies that I like most among the series of them is something that is very close to my heart, and this comes from a mock exercises that prepares veterans or soldiers for captivity. And obviously it's a mock exercise, so they kind of simulate captivity. And when the people were asked to identify their interrogator, a significant rate of them were misled by hints and erroneously identified other people who clearly had no physical resemblance whatsoever to the interrogator. So based on laboratory research on memory and some anecdotal case accounts, some argued that false memory of trauma can indeed be fabricated. And indeed, this is a raging controversy. The controversy is about the accuracy of the claims of repressed memories or recovered repressed memories, and the power of the misinformation and suggestion in altering memory. And in fact, therapists have consistently, over the last 20 years, been accused of using techniques that bring into question issues of transplanted memories, such as suggestions and the like. And there is a heated scientific debate about the authenticity of these memory, and this scientific debate is also affected by a public debate. In the United States, there have been a large cadre of public figures that came forth and revealed their own child sexual abuse, reporting that they had sometimes forgotten those events, and at a certain point in time, these memories just came back. These allegations, obviously, in the United States, like the United States, were accompanied by lawsuit, and this brought to the attention of the general public the issue of recovered memories. And it has actually been suggested that recovered memories are fabricated either by disturbed or vindictive adults, or that they're fostered by overzealous or poorly trained psychotherapists. There have been some harrowing experiences. One of them, this was probably the first one, it was George Franklin was actually convicted for the murder of an 8-year-old, and this was based on recollections that his daughter had. She was a friend of the deceased, and later on he was exonerated, and this was based on the fact that they could link the information that the daughter had actually presented in court with some data that she had read in a newspaper. Yeah, 2 minutes, okay. There have been a similar debate in Israel in 2000, actually 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. But what do clinical studies show? Clinical studies, retrospective studies show that actually there is high rate of incidents where supporting repression. But retrospective studies are not that great, we think, and particularly they're biased with regard to effort for recall. So there have been a host of prospective studies. And I won't go into all of them, but in general, those prospective studies with women who had documented medical records, it's not their own recollection, but there were medical records attesting to the fact that they've actually experienced child sexual abuse, and later on, 38% of them did not even recall the fact that they were abused. And there have been fluctuations in traumatic recall. An interesting study of U.S. Combat soldiers who had experienced, combatants who had experienced gruesome traumatic events. Some of them, and they were asked at 2 points in time about their trauma. So some of them recalled events 1 month ago and forgot it 2 years later, and some of them recalled later on experience that they did not report earlier. I'm not going to go into all the mechanism, as you know, I feel I should be on the good grace of my moderator here. And there are quite a few explanations of why events that were initially remembered were later forgotten and so on, and why did some memories come back. Some of it has to do with the nature of the memory, the mechanism of memory, and some of it clearly with some social and political issues. And let me just conclude, or the last study that I'm going to show is a prospective study that I've been doing with my own group. We started it when I was still head of research in the Israel Defense Forces Medical Corps, and I'm continuing those studies in Tel Aviv University. And we have a cohort of ex-prisoners of war and several other cohorts of individuals who fought in the Yom Kippur War. And we've asked them questions over several decades, questions about their traumatic events, and interviewed them in length. And we found that PTSD, that actually the recollection of captivity were increasingly getting negative over time. PTSD symptoms, particularly intrusion, were implicated in the amplification of traumatic memory. We believe that our findings suggest that memory is repeatedly updated and influenced by emotional state, and that there is a feedback loop whereby traumatic memory leads to PTSD, and PTSD in turn leads to increasing negative recollections of the traumatic events. In our prospective ex-prisoner of war study, an increase in PTSD was linked with increase of trauma recall, possibly in search of some cause for the worsening of their symptoms. They had to somehow find the rationale for why they're suffering so long, so many years after they've been repatriated. It seems that individuals with more severe intrusive memories, that is flashbacks and nightmares, gradually recall traumatic event as a result of involuntary experiencing symptoms. To come back to my beloved friend Noga's story. Was my friend a victim of incest who had repressed the memory of the assault, or is it a case of false memory? Given that memory is a cherished part of our identity, traumatic memory is fragile, and the search for the truth may be fraught with a lot of complexity. Traumatic memories may change during the course of psychotherapy, as they change naturally without any therapeutic intervention. The therapeutic perspective works with the person's current version. And we don't, therapists are not interested in what Chad Ha'am called emet archeologit, what really happened. Therapists are interested with the personal truth of the individual. We all know emet historit, emet archeologit, the distinction usually linked to Trumpeldor, right? The archaeological history is not clear. Probably, as some claim, he had uttered a Russian curse, but the historical and most meaningful memory is that he said, Tov lamut ba'ad artzenu, another contested issue. So what are the challenges? There are two spheres, but actually two cultures, the legal sphere and the therapeutic or the clinical sphere. And both of them are interested in different types of truths. But what we learn from memory and the implication of memory in the course of post-traumatic decline is that actually if we could, I don't know how moral it is, how ethical it is, but if we could do something with the template, temper somehow with the traumatic memories, some of the agony and some of the distress of these individuals, not to mention the dire cost that societies pay for that, could be somewhat lowered. And there have been a few attempts of that sort, which is beyond the scope of my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention.